Epic Games has spent almost 2 years fighting Apple and Google to free Fortnite, but it has lost battle after battle in the courts, and the game has still not officially returned to the iPhone. Epic's chances of winning the war appear to be getting slimmer by the day, but the European Union may have just turned the tide by formally adopting the Digital Markets Act on July 5th, 2022. This legislation introduces a list of requirements that companies classified as gatekeepers will have to abide by, including 2 that might completely reverse the failing direction of Epic's efforts. 1. Allow users to install apps from third-party app stores and directly from the internet, also known as sideloading. 2. Allow developers to offer third-party payment options. The return of Fortnite to iPhones through an Epic Games Store or simply via sideloading may now only be a matter of time. And consequently, big tech platforms like app stores are now facing the most formidable threat against their iron grips to date: the regulatory hammer of government. But is this legislation really what's in the best interest of consumers and for creating a leveled playing field for smaller competitors? Maybe not. The negatives for gatekeepers like Apple are obvious. They will no longer be able to keep certain apps from being installed and will likely see a significant decrease in revenue from one of the most lucrative business models in the last decade, the 30% App Store fee. But those are not the only changes that will be ushered in by the Digital Markets Act. There's more that companies like Apple and other digital platform holders must do. Allow interoperability with apps and services belonging to the gatekeeper like chat and messaging. Access to any hardware feature like NFC and secure elements. Ability to uninstall all apps including core platform services. Share data and metrics with developers and competitors. Ability to change the default voice assistant. On top of that, it also disallows gatekeepers from pre-installing apps like default web browsers, requiring developers use specific services or frameworks, and giving their own products preferential or prominent treatment. True to the spirit of bloated antitrust legislation, these requirements hollow out significant parts of a platform holder's competitive advantages, but are also not immune to unintended consequences or drawbacks, especially in the domain of security, privacy, and user experience.
And that brings me to our third area of concern: regulations that could put our privacy and security at risk. To be clear, Apple is in favor of privacy regulation, but we are deeply concerned about regulations that would undermine privacy and security in service of some other aim. Here in Washington and elsewhere, policymakers are taking steps in the name of competition that would force Apple to let apps onto iPhone that circumvent the App Store through a process called sideloading. And we have already seen the vulnerability that creates on other companies' devices. Early in the pandemic, for example, there were reports of people downloading what appeared to be legitimate COVID tracing apps only to have their devices infected with ransomware.
While this EU regulation can be considered groundbreaking, a significant amount of requirements simply describe an ecosystem that already exists, and you've probably heard of it. It's called Android. It is hard to seriously deny that the least curated versions of Android have an inferior user experience and much greater risk of malware compared to iOS. The best and most secure Android experience is that of Google's Pixel, which is more similar to Apple's approach to iOS, with a tighter integration of hardware, software, and services. This doesn't mean that Apple's approach is better, but allowing it means that consumers will have the full range of options from least curated to most curated. The language of the Digital Markets Act will mean a reduction of choice for consumers in the European Union and potentially worldwide. But it didn't have to come to this. Apple could have done something that Steve Jobs shared with everyone after revealing the first iPhone at Macworld in 2007.
There's an old Wayne Gretzky quote that I love. I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been. And we've always tried to do that at Apple.
On August 13th, 2020, Epic Games announced the Fortnite Mega Drop, which was a permanent 20% decrease in the price of V-Bucks across all platforms, including iOS and Android, but only if you chose Epic Direct Payment instead of using the native in-app purchase system. The move was considered bold, as incentivizing users to bypass the official in-app payment methods would almost certainly invite the wrath of Apple, which it did just hours later as Apple removed Fortnite from the App Store. The popularity of Fortnite on iOS at the time boasted 2.5 million daily active users and over 73 million total iOS-only players. But that was not enough to convince Apple to look the other way or modify their policies. This was not a surprise to Epic. They were prepared and knew that their bold actions were in violation of App Store guidelines. A lawsuit was immediately filed, along with a PR stunt that included a Fortnite-themed parody of Apple's iconic 1984 Super Bowl commercial, where IBM was depicted as a dystopian Big Brother stifling competition in the computer industry. That commercial was itself a reference to George Orwell's classic science fiction book titled 1984 on the consequences of totalitarianism and mass surveillance. The connection being that Apple had become a similar Big Brother figure and that Epic was the brave underdog in this fight to free mobile computing. Epic was not the first company to have complaints about Apple and Google's monopoly-like dictation of fees, but they put the most at risk in an attempt to change policies that, in hindsight, Apple and Google should have been doing all along. But both refused to read the tea leaves even after the judicial ruling came down in Epic's lawsuit against Apple.
Scott, we did just get that statement from Apple saying the App Store is not in violation of antitrust law. The company saying it remains committed to ensuring the App Store is a safe and trusted marketplace that supports a thriving developer community. The judge here saying that Apple is issuing a decision where Apple won 9 of 10 counts. She said Apple was not a monopolist. Success is not illegal. She says the court cannot ultimately conclude that Apple is a monopolist, but she did say that Apple does engage in anti-competitive conduct. It's going to be forced to change its App Store policies. She's ordering an injunction that says Apple will no longer be allowed to prohibit developers from offering links that direct users away from Apple's in-app purchasing system.
While the ruling was a win for Apple, they lost on the one issue that was clearly trending against them: allowing third-party payment options. This was Apple's second chance. If it wasn't clear where the puck was going when Fortnite was banned, then it should have been blindingly obvious now. Unfortunately, Apple continued to fight the trend and filed an appeal which temporarily halted the injunction to allow third-party payment options. This was even after Apple moved to lower the commission fee to 15% for developers making less than $1 million annually, settled a lawsuit filed by US developers to allow the sharing of information on making purchases outside of the App Store, and forced to allow third-party payment options in South Korea. Given all these signs and Apple's continued concessions regarding payments, it is hard to argue that they were completely blind to where the puck was going. At best, they were in denial. Apple eventually agreed to comply with South Korean law in early 2022, and apps there can accept alternate payment options, but developers will have to report sales and pay a 26% fee. If this sounds like a childish attempt to comply in letter but not in spirit, then you'd be right. But it also reveals that facilitating payments, subscriptions, refunds, and keeping a history is at most a 4% service, which is in line with providers like Stripe or Paddle. All other Apple-hosted services plus distribution may be worth the remaining 26%, but they are not used by every app, and clearly feels unfair to developers who know what they are paying in self-hosted servers and content distribution networks.
I've talked to plenty of developers who are grateful for the services that Apple provides. Don't you think you should pay some form of rent to access those services?
Yeah, competition is the way that prices are set in a fair market. For example, Apple provides bandwidth to all of these free apps and to paid apps so that you can download them to your device. You know who else provides bandwidth? Akamai is the #1 provider of CDN bandwidth, and Amazon is a competitor in the space. There are market rates associated with paying for bandwidth. There are market rates associated with payment processing. PayPal charges 2.5%. MasterCard and Visa charge 2.5% to 3.5%. The problem with the 30% that Apple and Google charge is it's completely disconnected from any actual costs of their business.
The Digital Markets Act will make iOS less secure in the aggregate. Those of us who are more technically savvy will be the least affected. But there are armies of extremely persistent and tenacious people wasting their lives running frauds and scams. A greater surface area for attacks simply means they will have more chances to succeed. There's no way around it. It is not a matter of a user's intelligence as much as it is about people being in a rush, lacking time, or just having trust by default. Governments are often a lagging indicator and run the risk of going too far once they can pass or adopt legislation by simple majority because society at large have already been moving in that direction. And since Apple misguidedly forged ahead in defense of revenue from App Store fees, for reasons of greed or hitting Wall Street earning expectations, public support for curbing monopoly-like pricing power is going to overshadow those of security and privacy. And that is what we're seeing today in the European Union and possibly the rest of the world. But there's still a chance for a more perfect future if Apple can change course as US legislatures have enacted yet.
There have been rules that have been similarly floated in the United States. You think they pick up traction if this is something that they're looking across the pond and thinking yes?
I think one thing Americans all have in common is we don't really care what the EU does about much of anything.
Thanks for watching to the end and being a completionist. Now if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button. I actually changed my mind while working on this video. I've long supported Epic's efforts to get Fortnite back on the App Store and generally demonopolize Apple and Google, while also being a big fan of Apple. And I had thought that the DMA, or the Digital Markets Act, was largely a good thing, since I agreed with the premise of openness and letting users install any apps they want on their phone, kind of like your desktop computer. But then I realized that if I really wanted to do that, I could have just used Android, but I don't. And it's an active decision since I have used Android devices in the past, namely tablets, and they are just littered with malware. These are not the best tablets. I think the version of Android itself was compromised. Now I could have installed a different version of Android into it since I used it as a development device already, but I just didn't want to deal with it. The fraud and scam industry is gigantic. I'm sure that you get a bunch of garbage emails and texts like I do. These people waste our time and their own time, but it's a multi-billion-dollar industry for criminals. And there's no reason to give these people more points of access. That said, Apple should have gotten ahead of this and changed their App Store review policies and the App Store fees. If Apple doesn't make any serious changes, then no amount of speeches from Tim Cook or other Apple executives will save us from the unintended consequences of government regulation. That's it for this video. If you're not subscribed, be sure to do so, and I'll see you in the next video.